As we talk about tides today, I'd like you to consider the relationship of the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon as tides are created. Now, as I go through and do our lesson today, please make sure that you're taking notes on this paper, pause the recording as needed, and when you get to the bottom, please make sure that your drawings and your explanations are very detailed. So let's go ahead and get started. Tides are known as the rise and fall of ocean water. During every 24-hour period, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides. If you've ever been at the beach, hanging out, playing down by the water, you might notice as the day progresses that the water tends to creep up on the shore. If you have your chair down by the water, your feet might start to get wet. Your magazine might start to get wet, and you notice that you have to start moving your chair backwards in order to stay dry. Same thing, you might be working on a sandcastle near the water's edge, and as the day progresses, you'll notice that your sandcastle starts to get knocked over and filled up with water if you don't move it back. That's our tides. If you take a look at this picture, this is an extreme example of high and low tides from an area known as the Bay of Fundy. In this very first picture, you can see people walking on the beach in Hopewell Rocks, New Brunswick. The large rock formations rise at least 30 feet above the sand. The second picture is the exact same location roughly 12 hours later. As you can see, the water level has risen and covered the beach entirely. If you assume the people in the photo are about 5 to 6 feet tall, you can estimate that the water has risen at least 15 to 20 feet. So in this first picture is an example of low tide. The second picture, high tide. Now, tides aren't nearly that extreme, except for this area called the Bay of Fundy. Tides occur because the moon's gravity pulls on different parts of the Earth. If you take a look at this picture here, as the moon's gravity is pulling, it's causing a bulge, and that bulge is where the high tide is. So on each side of the Earth, you're going to have 2 high tides, and here's your low tides per day. We'll get more into this in a second. But first, let's talk about spring tides. Twice a month, we have spring tides, which are higher than average tides. Spring tides happen when the sun and the moon are aligned. That happens during a new moon and a full moon phase. So they're lined up in a nice straight line. I like to remember spring tides are higher than average because if I jumped on a spring or a trampoline, I would be able to jump much higher than I would normally without the spring. The second type of tides are called neap tides. Now, neap tides are lower than average tides that take place at 90-degree angles. So you can see here, the moon is in its 3rd quarter phase, and if the moon was down here, it'd be in its 1st quarter phase. And you can see that's causing right here to be a low tide on both sides of the Earth and extremely high tides up here. So remember, neap, 90 degrees. So here's some keys to remember, and you might want to use these in your pictures at the bottom. During the new moon phase and the full moon phase, our tides are higher than normal, and that's our spring tide. You can see the large tidal bulge here. During the 3rd quarter phase of the moon and the 1st quarter phase of the moon, our tides are much lower than normal, and that's our neap tide. So let's think, why might it be helpful to know when high and low tides will occur? Well, if you're interested in fishing or surfing or clamming or sailing, tides are very important to people. Fish might concentrate during areas of low tides. Commercial fishermen who follow the tides learn to fish during levels of highest concentration. That way they can make the most money on the most fish in the most efficient use of their time. If you're a recreational fisherman and you don't fish for money, but you fish just for fun, you also might want to look into fishing when it's low tides because the concentrations of smaller fish attract the large trophy fish. Tides also help remove pollutants and circulate nutrients and ocean plants that ocean's plants and animals need to survive. Now, tides affect the depth of the water and the currents in and around coastal areas. For example, ships need to navigate the waters during high tide in some areas so that they don't run aground or run into the shore. Pilots who are piloting the ships actually take into consideration the water level, the width of the areas they're going to, and the direction of water flow to determine the best time to travel. If they're driving a ship, pilots might choose to travel when the tides are low so they can get their tall ships and tall loads under bridges. Tides also affect the currents. Tides and tidal current mix Arctic water that can't absorb a lot of sunlight with warmer tropical water, and that affects our weather patterns by storing the ocean waters. And this produces more predictable and habitable climates and conditions and balances the temperatures on our planet. Let's take a minute and see what Tim and Moby have to say.